Our account of the resurrection story this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 24th chapter. Listen now to what the Spirit is saying to her church this day. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen clothes by themselves, and then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Can you believe we're still at it? Last Easter, we all gathered around screens for our first virtual Easter experience, still unaware of the magnitude of what we were facing. I remember feeling so disoriented by a virtual Easter. Easter is all about incarnation, after all, and not gathering in a sanctuary with others to share the good news of the resurrection. It just felt off to me. So I felt inconvenienced and slightly annoyed because Easter got short-shifted. After all, the lilies and the dresses and the brass and the choir, all of those things that make Easter feel, well, like Easter. And they disappeared on a dime. This year, though, I don't find myself wanting for the huge Easter experience. This year, I just feel tired. A year of isolation, canceled plans, unending headlines about death and layoff and financial distress, stalled relationships, a year of school from home, parents trying to manage home life and work life all at once, a year of bartering with ourselves to hold on just a little bit longer. Preparing for Easter this year, I realized I can manage without the, quote, Easter experience that I've grown used to. Sure, that's what I yearned for last year, but this year I yearn for something different. This year, more than ever, I find myself yearning to believe that this story is true, needing to believe that what we proclaim today, new life and new hope, can be trusted. No one has been spared of endings in the last year. Every single one of us witnessed the end of life as we'd known it as the world shut down. And that one ending only prompted more: the end of jobs, the end of marriages, the end of the college experience, the end of security, the end of life, quite literally, for 550,000 Americans. And those endings just continue to compound. They weigh us down and they remind us that endings feel more definite than beginnings these days. The women in Luke's gospel hadn't lived through a pandemic, but they too felt more confident about endings than beginnings. It's the women who go to the tomb with spices. They believed that death got the final word, so they decided that the least they could do was show some respect. So they emptied out their spice jars and took them to the tomb to anoint the body, because the dead are supposed to stay dead. When they arrived, though, 2 angels greeted them and shared the news that Jesus wasn't dead after all. He has risen, the angels say. The women didn't see Jesus for themselves, but they saw the empty tomb. And somewhere between the angels' proclamation and their trek back home, one of the women must have piped up and said, "I remember." Maybe that's what he meant when he said that he came so that we may have life and have it abundantly. And then another woman piped up and said, "That's right. You know, Jesus did tell us that this would happen." And another still, "Remember when he told us that what is impossible for mortals is possible for God?" The women remembered. They remembered the healing, the inclusion, the joy, the forgiveness. They remembered the fullness of life that Jesus brought everywhere he went. So when they arrived back to the disciples, they were gleaming with joy and possibility and life as they shared the good news. And then the gospel writer says this, "But the words seemed to them," that is the disciples, "an idle tale." An idle tale. What a phrase. A long time ago, I promised myself that I wouldn't become one of those preachers who goes out of the way to recite the Greek and the Hebrew in sermons, not because I don't believe translation isn't important, but because I think that sometimes when preachers reach for those ancient words, it can unintentionally make the text seem like it was written for a different people in a different time and a different place. And we believe that the Bible is a living word, so it always has something to say to us in this time and in this place. But I'm going to break my own rule because I think that there is something too good here not to share with you. But the words seemed to them an idle tale. An idle tale. Doesn't that sound like Old English? It's such a tidy, well-kept phrase. But I'm afraid that there's been a lot lost in translation. The Greek word is leiros. That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Leiros. It just comes right off the tongue. And this word, it only shows up once in the entire Bible, and this is where it shows up. And I think our Puritan values are hard at work in this translation, because leiros is not an idle tale or nonsense, as our Bibles like to so politely say. Leiros means trash, garbage, or most accurately, cow excrement. We know something about that in the state of Texas, don't we? Leiros, as my friend and preaching professor Anna Carter Florence says, is a locker room word. It's a wet towel whipping through a chorus of jeers. So until high school boys start accusing each other of being full of idle tales, a more faithful translation would probably be, these things seem to the disciples like a lot of bull. Christ is risen, the women proclaim. Leiros, bull. New life is possible, they say. Leiros. More than ever, I appreciate the disciples' honesty because I get it. Have you met the possibility of change, the possibility of hope, the possibility of new life with the same exclamation as the disciples? In the last year, have you found yourself so bogged down by the reality of endings that the possibility of change seems like an idle tale? Seems like bull? It's the one time this word shows up in the whole Bible. Easter Sunday. It's news so good that it's unbelievable. It seems like Leros. And I think that the good news of Easter seems like Leros to all of us until we experience it for ourselves. And then remember that the promises of God are true and can be trusted. On Easter Sunday, preachers are inclined to pull out their best stories, the stories of overcoming addiction and infidelity, grief, loss, you name it. Preachers reach for stories of new life, of the transition from darkness to light. I include myself in this. We preachers on Easter Sunday reach for the stories of miracles we have witnessed in other people's lives so that Easter worshipers, so that you, yes, you, might believe that the resurrection will happen in your life too. But this year, more than ever, I'm with the disciples. Of course they responded in disbelief. The disciples didn't need to be told about the resurrection. They needed to experience it for themselves and remember. So I am going to repress my preacher instinct to pull out a remarkable story from my arsenal and tell you about the resurrection happening to someone else. Because after the year we've had, it may all sound like Leros to us. We don't need to hear about what's happened in someone else's life. We need to believe that resurrection is possible in our own lives. We need to remember that the truth of God's promises have echoed in our ears before and have unhardened our hearts. And so they are capable of doing that once more. After hearing from the women, Peter got up and ran to the tomb so he could see for himself. When he got there, he stooped down and looked in, and he was amazed. And then he went home. And I imagine, just like the women, he began to remember all that Jesus had said and remembered all those times that he realized that the promises of God could be trusted because they had shown up in his own life. Isn't that what we each need to do today? Because this Easter, I think the sermon that needs to be preached is one that can only be preached by you. As my theological hero, William Sloane Coffin, says, Christ's resurrection promises our own resurrection. Christ is risen for us to put love in our hearts, decent thoughts in our heads, and a little more iron up our spines. Christ is risen to convert us not from life to something more than life, but from something less than life to the possibility of full life itself. I don't know what resurrection looks like in your life. So instead of trying to put words in your mouth or woo you with somebody else's shiny story, I invite you to start looking around your own life, rolling away the stones from that which holds all that you consider dead, trusting that even there the fullness of life is possible. When has love grown in your heart? When has iron reinforced your spine? When have you gone from something less than life to the fullness of life itself? When have you remembered for yourself that God's promises can be trusted? It's okay if all you can say today is Leros. The good news is that the power and love of God is not thwarted by our shaky belief or our foul language. on this Easter Sunday of all days. Maybe our problem isn't that God is too hard to believe in, but that God is too good to believe in. A God who offers new hope, new life, a God who offers the possibility of a future filled with goodness, with beginnings in the wake of the year we've had. A God who offers nothing less than resurrection to each of us. Well, that may just sound like a lot of bull until we experience it for ourselves. So go run to the tombs like Peter, stoop down and look in. My prayer for you and my prayer for me is that when we get there, we are each overcome with amazement and we remember the promises of God. Friends, you are the only person who can preach the Easter sermon you need to hear today. Yours is the only experience that has the power to change your shouts of leiros to proclamation. So when you do remember that the promises of God can be trusted because they have shown up in your life before, I hope you preach. Preach with power and conviction that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Amen.